Welcome to Forget CPI, Dynamic Mobile Marketing. Hello, my name is Heather Gaynor, and I've been working at Kongregate the last 6 years. I started out doing web and email marketing, and after about a year of that, switched over to our mobile team, where I've been working for the last 5 years. Currently, I do user acquisition for a number of our games, which just means that I buy ads to get more installs for our games. Last year, we spent about $24 million on marketing for games for Kongregate. First, I figure most people probably know CPI is cost per install. However, I figure it's best to have it up there for clarity in case somebody thought this talk was on Consumer Price Index, which is the first result if you Google CPI. Second, I want to make clear that this talk is based on the assumption you're doing performance marketing, not brand marketing like, say, a Coca-Cola commercial. On a very basic level, when most people think of performance marketing, they want to make sure that their average CPI is less than their user lifetime value, or LTV, so that they'll have a profit margin. Thus, many people focus on getting the lowest CPI as possible. However, a lot has changed in the past few years, and most networks are now offering much more advanced ways to acquire users. So, if you're only focusing on a low CPI, this isn't necessarily in your best interest anymore. So here's a brief outline of my talk. First, I'm going to go over the goals and objectives of marketing in test markets versus global launch. Then I'll cover the KPIs we should be looking at beyond CPI. And finally, I'm going to talk about the new forms of network bidding available, especially ones that we've found success with for Kongregate. So let's jump in with some real-world examples. Idle Frontier is a game I've been the marketing lead on from before test markets until now, and hopefully well into the future. It's one of our in-house games made by Ultrabit, and it's a casual idle clicker game which has a fun cartoon art style and an old Western theme. It's meant to be broadly appealing. After 2 short months in test markets, the game officially launched globally July 25th, 2019. Test markets, also called soft launch or open beta, is the period where you're trying to collect some information prior to going into global launch. And during our test market for Idle Frontier, we had a few goals. First and foremost was stability, making sure the game isn't crashing on load or having bugs that prevent players from enjoying it. But after that, we wanted to collect data. For developers, they were focused on the first-time user experience, called FTUI, early retention, and buyer percent. But for marketing, we were asked to answer the question, is the game marketable? Well, the problem with this question is that it's a little bit tricky to give a definitive answer on during test markets. Although we've often cited the test market average CPI against what the expected lifetime value or LTV is, this really places more importance on CPI than there should be. Not to mention, there aren't enough data points in test markets to accurately create a reliable LTV. Furthermore, because the goals of buying installs in test markets are very different from post-launch, we're focused on buying very different kinds of users. So, in test market, our goal is to bring in a large number of varied users to help us get a baseline read for the game. We want to see the average user so we can optimize the FTUI to be as mass appeal as possible. We also want to make sure that we're getting lower-end devices as well as the high-end devices so that we can make sure the game works correctly across as many devices as possible. We furthermore want to keep the cost low to mitigate our risk. This is in case the test market runs much longer than expected or if the game is ultimately a failure. However, post-global launch, the marketing really only cares about one thing, profits. And for this reason, we're focusing on high-end devices and quality users. We want to bring in the best users we can, users that are likely to retain and spend. And we often use precise targeting to specifically find these users. So, could we buy these kinds of users in test markets? Sure, but it would take a lot of time and a lot more money, and it would work against our other goals. So most of the time, this is not recommended. Well, during test markets for Idle Frontier, our average CPI was $1.61, which was pretty close to what we would have expected from a casual game in these countries. But unfortunately, this created the incorrect expectation that the game would have a very low CPI in global launch. So when global launch happened, and remember, very different targeting, we had an average CPI of about 480, and some people started to get concerned. But at that point, we were only spending in the US, so people thought that perhaps, as we hit more geos, it would go down. Well, in August, we opened up to more countries, and the average CPI shot up to 626. And then in September, we spent in almost all countries, including a bunch of tier 3s, with the use of worldwide campaigns. And that average dropped less than 10 cents. So at this point, our developer team was worried that the CPI was far above what they expected based on test markets. They were worried that they had made a casual game, but that the game was acquiring users like a mid to hardcore game, which they didn't think would be sustainable. However, there were very good reasons for these higher than average CPIs. And spoiler, the game is totally marketable. So it took a little re-education, but we managed to quell their fears and get them to stop fixating on the high CPI. And hopefully by the end of this talk, CPIs won't scare you either. So let's talk about that re-education process. First off, your cost per 1,000 impressions is really what matters to the ad networks and ultimately what impacts the number of impressions you get. CPI is just one piece of that alongside your click-through rate and conversion rate. So am I saying we should focus on CPM? No. Unfortunately, the marketplace is a massive, ever-changing ecosystem. You'll get a very different CPM for every network and every source that you bid on, and it will change based on the current availability of the inventory and who else you're bidding against. Not to mention, you'll get wildly different results for different times of the year, like say for Christmas, and different days of the week, like weekends versus weekdays, and even different times of the day, because, well, people have to sleep. So if I'm telling you to forget CPI and CPM, what should you be focused on? At the end of the day, what really matters is if your spend is profitable. So there are two sets of metrics you should be looking at to determine this. How does your early performance look? And based on that, what do you think your long-term performance will look like? So for Idle Frontier, the main metrics that we use to gauge early performance are the D1, 3, and 7 retention, as well as we collect more data going deeper. And as I'm sure you know, it's very important that we keep users in our game, because that's how we get them to spend money or watch ads. The second set of metrics that we look on are all based on revenue. Although there's a lot of ways that you can look at revenue, the two early ones we use the most are the D7 buyer percent and the D7 ROAS, or return on ad spend, which I'll get into more detail on soon, I promise. So, buyer percent. It's important to make sure that your numbers aren't inflated by a small number of big purchases. And as for the D7 ROAS, Idle Frontier, we've found that most of our users who are likely to spend will make that first purchase within the first week. But some games see spend happen earlier, like by day 3, while other games might see it happen at a much later date. So pick a day that makes sense for your game. The early ROAS is an important metric that we use to benchmark to see if we're above or below our standard payback curve. So let's talk about payback curves. If you want to be competitive and bid effectively, you need a way to predict downstream revenue. The most common term in our industry is LTV, but that term really holds very little meaning. Because how long is a lifetime? Is the value net or gross? And is it total revenue so far or projected future revenue? Everyone you talk to defines LTV a little differently. But no matter which method you use, it's important to make sure that everyone on your team is using the same method. At Kongregate, we've actually renamed LTV ENPV, which stands for Estimated Net Player Value. It lets you know that it's estimated, as opposed to what we've earned so far, and it also lets you know that it's net, not gross. Furthermore, internally, we've decided that it will always include ad revenue alongside in-app purchase. Plus, since we calculate on a payback curve, we always talk about ENPV with a date. So we can have a D30 ENPV, a D180 ENPV, or in the case of Idle Frontier, we consider lifetime about a year, so we use the D360 ENPV most often. It's also worth noting that Idle Frontier isn't even a year old yet, but we base that payback window on other idle games in our portfolio, specifically a few other idle games that Ultrabit has made. The image at the bottom is our blended curve for Idle Frontier. But we have curves for each platform, country, network, etc. And it's important to note that ENPV changes quite a bit based on the subset of data that you're looking at, as you can see just by looking at the organic LTV versus the paid. There's a number of methods that you can use to build your LTV curve, and to be honest, I didn't build ours. That was our wonderful analytics team. Nor do I have the time to get into LTVs and how to build them in this talk. But basically, most methods, including our own, will at a minimum look at revenue and retention by day. We also attribute a small percent of our organic users to our paid. We call this K-factor, and we calculate it based on the lift that we see from our organic baseline as we spend will increase. So some of these users, maybe they saw the ad and downloaded the game later, so they were attributed as organic. Or maybe their friends are playing and they decided to download. But for whatever reason they joined our game, we know that as spend increases, we also see organics increase. So back to Idle Frontier. For those first few months with their crazy high CPIs, we also had crazy good return on ad spend, or as we call it, ROAS. We calculate this using the total net revenue divided by the total spend. The bar to the left is the actual ROAS to date with K-factor included. The bar to the right is our D360 ENPV, or what we consider to be the lifetime value. So when our CPIs were so high, how did our ROAS look so strong? Well, it all comes down to how we were targeting users. Like I mentioned, for test market, our targeting was very broad. We wanted to see how different users performed in the game. However, post-launch, we were focused on profits, and so we were no longer just looking for an install, we were looking for a qualified user. By qualified, I mean people who were going to stay in the game and who were likely to make a purchase. Thus, we were willing to pay more money to acquire those users. Many networks now offer a variety of different options beyond the standard flat CPI bidding, where your bid is dynamic. So you'll pay more for users who are likely to be high quality, and you'll pay less for users who are likely to be low quality. So let's jump in on a few of those networks and talk about some of the different bidding options available that can bring in more volume and higher returns. I'm going to start with Facebook because it's probably the most familiar network to everyone. They offer a variety of ways to bid, but the one we've consistently seen the highest returns on is value optimization, or VO. This style of bidding will go after the highest profit margins. These users might cost a lot, but they'll also have some of the highest returns. We've seen average CPIs as high as $14 for Idle Frontier that have backed out for us, which, if you're not familiar with casual games, is quite a high CPI. But if you are familiar with Facebook, it probably doesn't surprise you at all. One thing that we found when using VO is that setting a minimum ROAS goal actually severely limited our reach. And it also didn't seem to improve our ROAS. So in general, we've opted not to set a minimum ROAS or to set it to 0.01. Google's the next big one. Google does offer ROAS campaigns, but they're still in beta and they're still working on those. Instead, we've seen the most success with their in-app action campaigns, using purchase as our action. So instead of bidding on a cost per install, we're bidding on a cost per action, or in this case, a cost per purchase. One of the biggest constraints in the past for us to get Google to be profitable was that their machine learning would require a minimum of 10 actions a day, or 10 purchases in this case, and often about 3 weeks before it would start bidding effectively. In the past, we've often had to spend upwards of $30,000 or more just to get things working. And that's a lot of cash to burn up front. However, one thing Google has done recently to improve this is Firebase. We added Firebase to our games, and then Google collected our purchase data not just from the users they acquired, but from all of the users. And then this makes it much, much faster for the machine learning to get ramped up. In fact, we found using Firebase with Idle Frontier, it took less than a week for us to get our campaigns up and going, which is a big money saver and well worth the implementation time and effort. IronSource is a rewarded video network, and we also use them for ad mediation. They offer ROAS bidding, which you'll see from other networks like Unity and AppLovin. However, their biggest advantage over their competitors is that they use both in-app purchase and ad revenue in their ROAS calculations. So, since we use them for ad mediation, they have our actual ad revenue data. And this means that their bidding on ROAS is way more accurate. So, for games like Idle Frontier that are close to a 50-50 split of in-app purchase and ad revenue, it's hugely advantageous. It may not be as big of an advantage if your game is only in-app purchase, but let's be honest, any game can benefit from a little bit of ad revenue. So, we definitely recommend it. Their algorithm bids on a source level, either up or down to match your ROAS goal. And this means you'll pay less for sources that are lower value and more for sources that are higher value. It is worth noting that it's better than just blacklisting a source because sometimes you can actually see payback on very low average CPIs of, say, 5 or 10 cents that you'll still get some volume from and a high ROAS. Unity is another rewarded video network, but most of you probably know them as a cross-platform game engine. Well, this gives Unity a huge amount of user-level data, and it allows them to target on the user level instead of on the source level like IronSource. Unity has their own qualification system for a dynamic CPI, and you need about 100 retention users to qualify or 10 purchases to qualify for the purchase version of this dynamic CPI campaign. It's not very hard to qualify and certainly a lot faster than Google. However, 10 purchases isn't a lot, and much like the other systems, you're going to do better with higher amounts of data. So we don't recommend starting with only 10 purchases. Furthermore, it's worth noting that you should set a realistic ROAS target. If it's too high, you'll completely kill your volume. And also, don't set a whitelist or a blacklist. That will kill your volume as well. Since Unity is targeting on the user level, that source level really doesn't impact the campaign performance anymore. Finally, Moloko is a demand-side platform. They bid directly on real-time bidding exchanges or RTB exchanges. You give them a ROAS target, and their machine learning strives to hit your target. And you also have an account rep who oversees everything just to make sure that you're hitting your targets. I've actually been really impressed with our account rep, Myra. On the few occasions that I felt like we weren't close to our ROAS goals, I've reached out to her, and I found out that she's proactively already made cuts and changes to the campaigns. So far, we've consistently been seeing high performance from them on a number of our games, including, of course, Idle Frontier. So let's sum it up. Flat CPIs are the old way of bidding. Although I only focused on a few networks that we're using for Idle Frontier, almost every network now provides a way to bid into deeper metrics. So whether you're bidding towards retention or purchase or directly towards a ROAS goal, your CPI might be higher, but you'll find that you typically can spend more profitably. As more and more networks begin to utilize machine learning and downstream data to find qualified users, your average CPI stops mattering as much. And I'm not saying stop optimizing your creative for lower average CPIs, or that every game can spend profitably with super high CPIs. I'm just advocating focusing your energy and your efforts on better downstream reporting and calculating your estimated payback, using whichever method makes sense for your game and your company's goals. Because the days of flat CPI bidding are behind us, and at the end of the day, profits are what matter most. Unfortunately, you're watching this talk pre-recorded, and I have forgotten to put the questions thing up here. So, how can you contact me? Oh my goodness. Well, you can reach out to me at Kongregate.com. My name there is Heather. You can also reach out to our BD team at BD@Kongregate if you're interested in potentially working with us in the future. I apologize for not updating this slide, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.